everybody. I would like to welcome Bill Davis. He will be sharing about his photographic work featured in a three-person exhibition called Nurture Nature 3. It was with Christine Carr and Mille Guldbeck, and it was featured in our Learning Resource Center gallery. You can see it featured behind me here, and that was through March through June of 2022. Bill has his work is collected and registered in museums and private collections throughout the US, online and abroad. He's worked in 6 continents, so we are truly honored to have had his work in one of our gallery spaces accessible to our students during this time. He is also currently a professor and coordinator of photography at the Frostic School of Art at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo. So I will turn it over to Bill, and he will be sharing some images of his work and sharing what it's all about. So thank you, Bill.
So thanks to you, Amy, in your intermediate exhibition design class for installing the work that's in the still image behind you, and College of Sequoias as well. So let me start to share my screen and I can begin. Okay, I just want to check you can see the image and quote. Great. All right. This No Darkened Sight project has taken me to a lot of places historically and geographically, but I did want to start with what I think is a very important and prescient quote for its time and day. You'll notice I'm starting off with an image as well as a GPS indicator that was kind of hard to get. And then the exposure in situ. So the small snapshot on the bottom left is a picture I took of my camera while I made the image, the larger image that you're seeing. I do want to illustrate that it's not just pointing a camera and taking a quick pic. And this is Ollantaytambo. I'll share it a little bit later. In Viracocha in Peru. So in the bottom left image is a dog who became very interested in my tripod and mistook it for a tree, which many male dogs will do during the exposure. However, it does take a lot of patience and time, and I'm really grateful to be able to share the work and its message and some of the behind the scenes stuff that goes into it. I'm also glad to see that College of Sequoias had a show that addressed sustainability in nature. And I believe this is the 3rd one, if I understand it correctly. So bravo to College of Sequoias for having that foresight. So it often seems to me, being Van Gogh, the night is much more richly colored than the day. That was in 1888. So I began to think about that quote as I also began to think about the false promise of a post-industrial revolution. Fancy way of saying, wow, how do we get ourselves into this mess? I'm not sure progress is a net positive, and that's what this project started to become about. I began to think about the access that artists had to natural darkness and what that meant for their work, and the access that I had to the world I live in, and what technology meant for my work. After all, photography is a medium that since its birth has bragged about technology. It's machine-assisted art, and so machines haven't always been the most welcomed component of our landscape, cultural and geographical. So it's an image of Edison on the right. I often would have wanted more instructions and warnings to come with the light bulb, among many other things, as I began to study light, artificial light at night. So about 10 years after the light bulb intervened on the naturally dark night, which was around 1889, that changed the landscape of our biosphere. And I began to wonder how my discipline intersects. In other words, how do I as an artist intersect with technology, and how do I intersect with light, and am I sustainable? Is my discipline sustainable? And these became much more urgent questions for me in the past 15 years or so. So that would be basically from about 2009 till about now. And when I began to be much more interested in sustainability, right? Social, economic, and environmental. But this is a problem because I use light, and it's how I was trained. And so I depend on natural and artificial light to make my work. This led me to No Dark in Sight, and it's a project that basically conveys how light is used to manage culture. And I've kind of reached this conclusion that it's a pretty poison. And we're kind of overlighting the night sky. So I began to study this a little bit more and to make images outside my back door or in a neighboring state. I live in Michigan, Southwest Michigan. And this is an image that, an early image that I made in Northern Indiana. And at the top of each smokestack, I kind of saw what I thought was a soft crime. And I began to see artificial light as some kind of crime scene, maybe not what we would define as a popularly described or defined crime scene, but at the same time, it seemed to me that all the kind of tropospheric trespass that light exudes into the atmosphere for a variety of different reasons, whether for security or whether, and that's arguable, or whether for night shift workers, et cetera, was over-serving its purpose. This is a November image made in America's Heartland, as I said earlier. And it's kind of a celebration of religion with holiday lighting at the top of the smokestacks. And it was a very important contrasting image because some light is necessary. I want to indicate that I'm not opposed to artificial light. I'm not anti-electricity, I'm not anti-light, but I am pro-wisdom. And so this is an example of where there's probably very necessary lighting and very unnecessary lighting. So I began to study and think more about the unnecessary parts of light that are having an effect, knowing that I would have limitations to the project. I wasn't going to get in a plane and make overhead images from far above in the middle of the night. I began to really focus on the pedestrian eye level experience, and it was really quite easy. So this is really the first edited image, and I made this from my front yard. I thought that I'd have to go really far outside of a small city of about 70,000 people where I live. And later on, you'll see how wrong I was. This whole project is kind of about being wrong, right? And it creates a bit of an identity crisis for photography. If you consider this to be a documentary project, because you at one time become a victim of your own investigation by going out and looking directly at the light you shouldn't be looking at to say, I shouldn't be looking at that, and neither should you, but I am. And at the same time, trying to reconcile with the nature of photography. The fact that this project is quote unquote successful is because I was able to find things that I would call pretty poisons. And if photography means to write with light, I'm photographing the biography and anatomy of artificial light and its impact at eye level. Like the street light, for example. I don't show this image terribly much, but I never really put the time and investment into printing it. So whether it's like Van Gogh's Starry Night or Church's Aurora Borealis, right, these artists, they were for art historians or others, they were telling the stories of their time, right? And I think a lot of people, so many people, they'll say, hey, there's this great dark sky, natural dark sky preserve, and there's a limitation on artificial light, and that's where you need to go. You should go to these places. And I would love to. But the goal of the project is to go to the opposite places, and to some of the really bright places at night, and to be quite practical and forthcoming. It's where the funding was. So there are so many beautiful images and pieces in art history and made today of starry nights. So I was more interested in the grotesque side of what that would indicate. So I might even classify this as grotesque art. And I saw light as an interruption to the message of the natural darkness. I read The End of Night, a fantastic book. The author's name escapes me right now. And the poet, I think Hungarian poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, they had a lot of important things to say about the kind of the power of darkness, the power of natural night. So I thought, wow, we're like interrupting something that is very powerful. And I was always taught, and I grew up in a culture that prioritized light over darkness, right? And the light at the end of the tunnel, as if darkness, metaphorically, is something inherently bad, and we should avoid it, and we should light every dark spot in life. And it's just so counterintuitive to the way nature intended darkness to be perceived. So I do want to point out, here we have examples of darkness making art history possible, making art possible, right? Because if you can imagine right now, and this was in 2016, in Provence, France, which is where Starry Night was painted, what that might have meant if someone tried to paint that now. And just in a fanciful way, I imagined what that Starry Night might look like if Van Gogh were painting today using Photoshop. But I think it's important to understand also that artificial light makes art history possible. And I want to thank Dr. Laura Wynn at Jacksonville University, professor in art history, who wrote a really fantastic article that highlighted some of the futurists in the early turn of the 20th century. And this had escaped me, which is why I love art history so much and what historians bring to the table, because the image on the left is made in around 1910 and 11, and is a great prescient painting of what was in our future. You can see the slice of the moon at the top right in the left image. So I began to see what I was doing is something kind of in line with what other artists had been doing. But I also thought like photography had an identity crisis. As an artist trained in light, I was supposed to embrace it. And now I'm thinking light is a friend, right? And if light looks like, but if night looks like day, that's a real problem. And that's the identity crisis. Like if natural darkness can't look like itself anymore, then I don't know what you call yourself, right? And so these are images that I began to make around my city, knowing that I needed to get further out. And I want to contrast something here, right? Because I applied for funding and I got to go to Las Vegas. I think I was the only artist there. At times it was very surreal, and it's not a place where too many artists envision going, right? But it was the perfect spot, and it was considered the brightest place on night Earth at the time. It might still be, or whenever people are watching this in the future. So I was surprised that in a comparative way from a light pollution map that my hometown of Kalamazoo in Vegas had a lot of similar traces of light pollution. So I still went, and I'll try to bring that. I'll share some work. I will share some work a little bit later with that. At the bottom, you'll see the Boral dark sky scale. And this is a kind of, oh, it's an indicator, a brightness index that is used to measure light pollution. And I came across that and thought, well, this is something I should be using and studying in my applications for funding to go to places and make images. I had to offset um, artificial light with natural light. So I ended up going down to Peru, to Cusco, to Machu Picchu, Ollantaytambo, where Viracocha is, and wanted to also study how natural light was used in ways that we don't entirely use it anymore. Like, for example, at Viracocha and Ollantaytambo, when on a clear day light passes through or by the side of a spot on this mountain that I showed earlier, I'll show again, it indicates the harvest. So there are these times when light hits a very certain spot on the ground, and it was used as a calendar in a way. So I did want to offset the project that way. And I thought, well, what a great way to say, let's compare these two things. So I think we live in a comparative world, and it's important to see that. But as I began to inch my way towards getting down to South America, I made some other images and traveled. And it turns out that light pollution was everywhere. And, I had traveled quite a bit before, not necessarily for the project, and then began to and had other opportunities in Europe to photograph. And then eventually I did get to Las Vegas. And I know that Northern California also has its issues with artificial light and does a lot. And just doing some research before I began this presentation on preserving naturally dark spaces. So like most stories, this one begins in your home. This is an image that reminded me of the pyramids of Giza. And I was surprised that I wouldn't need to travel far. And this was in Southwest Michigan. This was a shopping mall development that now is completed. And it would not surprise me at all at some time in the future if it was demolished and rebuilt. I'm seeing perfectly well lit, structurally sound buildings being demolished and rebuilt. Not sure why, but with more lighting. So to me, this is like the birth of a new normal. This one was odd to me. This, you saw an image earlier of this. I think you saw my tripod and camera. This was probably about 14 to 16 feet high. And many malls will be, parking lots will be used to gather snow. And it was oil and water, and they just didn't mix. I thought, wow, well, oil and water don't mix. And it reminds me of artificial light and dark skies. So I went ahead and made this image, even though there was this implied dark sky, but it was such a well-lit mountain of snow, and these parking lots were as well lit as the snow, which is why I wanted this to be eye level, because having major impact on our circadian rhythm. And for those people who have trouble sleeping at night, exposure to light, and especially blue light, can be one of the reasons why. Right. So we're basically torching our landscape. And in essence, night Earth is getting about twice as bright every 12 years. So I have received phone calls from people. I think they think that I can wave a magic wand and make a phone call to a policymaker and get rid of the lights in their neighborhood. I'm not. I've been defined as an artist activist, and I kind of like that. So yes, okay. But I think it's hard to reverse plans that are so well set that after the light annoys you the first night it's in a neighborhood, there's not much you can do about it at that point. So it's good for people to get involved and be aware, and to try to pay attention, which is really the goal of the project. As I said, this is about 5 years in on the project. In reflection, I'm not sure how much difference it made, and that's really hard to say. I wanted to, and I have exhibited quite a bit in United States and elsewhere. But I would like it to have an impact, and it's just hard to measure something like that. So this is a facade. This is another style of light that I came across, and it's direct uplighting, as you can see from the shadows. And it's meant to honor a university's legacy, but it just was so odd that I would go to places that were so well lit that I could have handheld the camera. Like I use a tripod. And for anyone who's not sure what that means, essentially, if you're going to make exhibition quality prints, you would want to take a tripod with you. And, you know, this image was made at 11 p.m. at night. And really, there's no Photoshop. I want to point out there's really no Photoshop tricks here. So I could have handheld this one as well. And it's obviously an intramural field. And like I said, I'm not opposed to artificial light at night. But then I began to ask, like, wait a second, I'm the only one on this entire baseball field. So what's the point? Like, do they know I was coming? Do they know about this project? I didn't make any calls. So that became kind of interesting. But I also realized that the project would be a bit discontinuous if I wanted to study the effect of artificial light on more than just human beings like myself. So this was a huge swarm of, well, I would guess bat food that was surrounding the flagpole. And they may have been in other places, but to concentrate food in one singular area, I would think is a dangerous prospect for nature. So flag lighting, which is direct uplighting, is crazy attractive for moths. And on the right side, you see almost like a plume of smoke. You know, all of these insects mesmerized by the light. So I began to also try to study places and go to places where I would see light as more of a material form. It's very hard to make light your subject matter because it's so ethereal. Because it's usually about the object, right? And so light as an object, it was a bit hard to photograph. Right? So this to me is what a broken food chain looks like. I also came across a couple of trees that had been compromised and read that they are attracted to artificial light. So here are another couple of snapshots. On the bottom left, exposure in situ. And in the blue rectangle, you'll see the tripod. It was quite a large tree. But then from the side, on the bottom right, you can really see how it was leaning towards this parking lot. And eventually, when I went back about 2 months later, it had fallen at that point. And holidays became something also that I began to study and pay attention to because, again, that idea of light over darkness and draping nature in artificial light, and now, turning, the turn of the season, did turn my attention to artificial light that was much more intentional at light displays and festivals of lights and holiday events. I came across aquatic life too. And I thought, wow, I don't know what it's like to be a fish underwater to see this kind of light if you look up, if they're able to even see that. I'm not sure, but because it's not natural to aquatic life, I can't imagine this as the ceiling that you see when you're in a dormant phase. I wouldn't want to look up in the middle of the night and see this on my ceiling. It'd be hard to get any kind of dormancy or quote unquote sleep. Right? And of course, larger ponds, larger spaces, so Chicago, but it's made from northern Indiana. I was about 40 miles away. And that tiny little spot was the Sears Tower, but it really significantly lit up the night sky. And my radar was up, And I was looking for these, and these spaces were easy to find. So I got closer into the city. This is not a fisheye lens. A lot of people think it's just gotten some kind of trick. You would have seen this too if you'd been standing with me. And I made this triptych in Chicago. Again, going back to religion or spirituality. This is a temple that's beautifully lit every night, and it's in northern Illinois. And I thought, well, why leave the lights on after the last prayer? I found myself immersed in light and being like one of the only few people in an entire space. And there's not a lot of evidence that lighting makes us more secure. So if the goal is to light things for security, the jury's kind of leaning towards the fact that it doesn't necessarily make us as secure as we think. So that exposure to artificial light at night, also speaking of insecurity, can lead to things like cancer, dementia, diabetes, a host of other illnesses. And I would find people hypnotized and dazed in the light, the same way a moth would be in a flag light. This was a nighttime display at a major zoo. And it was so odd to me that I was trying very hard to avoid the problem of light flare. And there was this huge bug zapper above me. But I was at the insect house. And I was there in December at a major zoo. And I asked a zookeeper, maybe, or someone in a management position who was managing the crowd and the space walked by, and I just asked them really quickly, like, okay, so there's a bug zapper and then there are insects. I'm just wondering, I don't know, just kind of curious, is it preventative, protective? And so, well, she said, we don't want insects getting out. And maybe there's some benefits to that, but I thought, well, did they want to get in? Again, I don't want to oppose the good things that zoos do, but the curiosity was just phenomenal to me. It's like putting a wolf trap outside of a wolf preserve, maybe. I couldn't help but start to people watch, but as people watching who were watching light at night and thinking, you're just not going to get to sleep, right? Just go get find something to do for a couple of hours, right? This was an image that I made close by, and I overlooked it to where I live. But it felt to me a lot like Masaccio's Expulsion from Eden. I couldn't figure it out for a really long time. I've like seen this kind of pose before. And it's like so much reminding me of that, that I thought, well, this is like a great metaphor, and that burning fire of light in the bottom left side really just worked so serendipitously. I didn't see it, when I made the image. But again, these are spaces that are consumer-driven spaces, and I'd like to say that we're using light to accommodate consumer behavior. When these places are closed, I don't need to drive to an empty parking lot to a place that's closed at 9 o'clock on a winter night. I'm not going to get, there's no benefit, right? And especially if it's blue light at night. This is the Underground Railroad Freedom Center, and it's facing the Ohio River, Kentucky on the other side. And I, began to think like this is like a huge melting moon. And, I don't want to forget about the importance of a dark sky to, its visibility to the North Star. I went to go make an image of a Ferris wheel, which I made on the left, and, okay. But then I turned around and I thought, wow, that's, to me, like that's the real story. Just turn around 180 degrees and made the image on the right, which is such an important discovery process in photography, is to actually find something along the way that can speak more culturally with more volume than what you thought. So I don't really show the image on the left. It's just something that I like to share in a presentation, right? And the fact that, you know, many American ancestors were navigating, you know, using the North Star is such an important symbol. And I know that it's skewed by more than 100 years. So it's a profound thing to think about how natural darkness meant so much to so many varieties of populations, and still does. I eventually made it to Las Vegas. The image on the bottom mesmerized me, and I titled it Electric Candleland. And if I gave 40 billion people, I have to wait a while for that to happen on the earth, a candle, it would look like this. So this is what took me to Vegas. It was in my grant application. It's the Luxor Casino, and it's the Luxor light. So it's considered, you know, the brightest light on night earth. And again, this is an example. I'm not anti-light, pro-wisdom, but when this was built, they said you could see it with the naked eye from, you know, from the air. Okay, so like, and that is a benefit, how? You know? So those are the questions I began to ask. I was then about 30 miles away with the Astronomical Society, atop Mount Potosi. In this image, now if you look to the right of the dome, or the small observatory, you'll see the Luxor Casino light. So there's a map. In that context, this project was kind of documentary. I made it to the Hoover Dam. And this is help push it because I felt like this when I get home around 3 in the morning. I would photograph until about 4 a.m. and go start at 9 p.m. when I was out in Las Vegas. Right? And it's just like it had like a liter of strong coffee every hour. So yeah, you don't need coffee. If you want to stay up, just stare at blue light. And I was also surprised when I got down to Peru to see just how much artificial light was there. I would not have needed my tripod. This was an aqueduct in the town of Ollantaytambo, where Viracocha was. And I'll share that image with you in a second, but I was starting to become disillusioned after this long trip, and it is many legs, because I thought I would see more natural darkness. Of course, I went to photograph natural light, and this is the Incan Sacred Valley, and this is called Moray, which was like an agricultural laboratory, and I kind of had to check this off the list. And I thought, you know, I've been in Peru, I don't know, I was there for 6 or 7 days. I'd been there before, so I kind of knew how to get to the places I needed to go. I thought, well, I'm going to check these off the list, but all of a sudden I'm discovering that there's a lot more artificial light in Cusco, and now there's an international airport. Maybe by the time people are watching this, it will have been built in Urubamba, so people can go to Machu Picchu. So, you know, I began to kind of climb as high as I could get to photograph this natural space that was a laboratory that would allow light from all sides to enter, so you could grow different things at different microclimates, so that I could point out, or as my original application in a grant indicated, that there are really positive uses for natural light. And this is how people managed their culture using light, right? And Vegas is how people are managed using light as well. Just 2 different populations and 2 different time periods. So, you know, I had traveled at least 10,000 miles for the project at this point. And you can see the small dots in the photo of the people below. So I wouldn't say that I was a tourist as much as I was a traveler. And I thought I was all alone, but for a brief time I had a companion. And the only reason I include this is that this is just a quick snapshot. I turned around, and, a very robust, happy dog. But the reason I include it is because later I noticed, after I returned to the States, that it had 1 blue and 1 brown eye. I thought, wow, that like is such an interesting component to the project for me, because it kind of is, you know, sky and earth. This is Ollantaytambo and Viracocha, which I showed earlier. So it's like a grain pantry, a kitchen, refrigerator. right? And I made images at night and day, but I was really surprised to see it lit so strongly at night. So I was very surprised to see such an abundance of overlighting when it seemed to me unnecessary in some places. And I think it's just going to continue to grow that way. So whether it's like, mall development in Michigan, or Hell's Kitchen in Las Vegas, or the retirement garden in Madrid, I got to photograph there. It's everywhere. And I just hope people become more aware of how it exists in their lives and what they might be able to do about it. Because I do think there's hope, and it doesn't take a lot. And you personally can make a difference if you just look around and mitigate your use of artificial light at night, whether it's personally or even in a public space, because quality of light affects quality of life. And we need light. I'm not against it, but we also need this. So there's more information about the project and other things I've done at this website. And again, my thanks to Amy Rangel and the students of COS in the school as well. And I can stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you so much, Bill. That was fascinating. I mean, I think there's some things that I've been jotting down notes as you were going, because I think there's some things that I think are important to kind of touch on, and that seeing the distance that you took, the physical distance and the locations that you went to in order to capture light, I think really is important to highlight, because it talks about the level of patience, the level of commitment, the level of dedication for a creative practice, and that sometimes the logistics of something isn't as immediate as we would like it to be. I mean, I think that's the same thing for like cultural shifts and societal shifts, and like the romantic idea is that things would happen like really, really fast. But in reality, it takes years sometimes to fully really to see something really come to fruition. And I think what's fascinating about this project is that you could have continual decades of working on this project. How have you sort of mitigated what your expectations were, your assumptions were? I think you mentioned the idea of quote being wrong, that idea of like the assumptions of things. Like, how has that shifted since you started this to now? And can you just talk about a little bit more about like the dedication, like the level of patience that's required, even just with setting up to take a photograph?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people, I don't know what, this would be a great question to ask professional artists, photographers. What would you do in the middle of an exposure of a dog raised its leg on your tripod, right? And I guess I would say that you're never going to make it if you're not patient. And maybe it's something you're born with. It's also something you can work on. It's something you can recognize, like, uh-oh, maybe this is a moment where I would become impatient. And we're all impatient. Let's not forget that too. Like, that's just on the other side of the coin. But the project, it changed my relationship to photography because when I was younger, I'd like to call it training. I've done a lot of work in a lot of different places, doing lots of different things, whether for medical schools or for hospitals, catalogs, museums, assisting. I lived in Prague for 2 years in a kind of Bolshevik architecture. So when I put light on trial, right, and I was like, okay, so you say that you are the most important thing to my discipline, prove it, right? Because I just came across something really interesting, and that is, you in your artificial form, light. And so, but you have to make friends with the process and yourself and the discipline. But there's also some less appealing parts to it, you know, like traveling, right? To go tell a story about sustainable things. Can you talk about something sustainable? For sure, it's easy. Can you sustainably do something sustainably? Like, can the process be sustainable? And that's where you do everything you possibly can to be open to change, to be open to mitigation, right? Like the goal is mitigate first, tell the story second. I tried as much as possible to do that. And then you present it and you do it honestly. You know, there's a great article by Bill McKibben, and he actually came to Southwest Michigan and had a small moment to meet him. And, you know, he talks about the fact that hypocrisy, in a way, I'm paraphrasing, I don't think he used that word, is just part of the process, you know, of highlighting something, you know, in indicating the cracks in the structure of something that you thought was perfect. And I think every person who spends long enough in a discipline will start to notice those things, like, wow, it's not what I thought it was, but, you know, it's not going to make me walk away from it. I just can try to make it better.
Right. I think some interesting things too that came to mind as you were talking about, like when you showed the image of the baseball diamond, and basically it was like you were the only one there. It was 11 o'clock at night, and it literally, like, because you couldn't necessarily see sky in that image, it was more of like the impacts of light on the actual space at eye level. It makes me think about the relationship to the other parts of the natural environment, and thinking about the birds and the bees and the insects and everything else that rely on an environment in which there is a cycle of day and night. And some species have started to adapt. There was a really interesting discussion with the writer, I think it's Ed Young, and it was on like noise pollution was more of the emphasis. It just came out in the Atlantic, and you know, just the impacts of the residual like white noise of traffic flow. But there was some discussion on like the impacts of light pollution, and that our biological rhythms of what is day and what is night, and what our bodies do in daytime, what our bodies do at nighttime, and how this blurring of time and the narrowing of the darkness, or narrowing of the quiet, is being reduced down so much that it's, you know, obviously causing all of these other problems that we didn't recognize. But I think the thing that I found most fascinating that you said right towards the end was about, you know, the leaving a lot of these lights on in, say, the baseball diamond, in the shopping mall parking lots, or in the big box stores, and they're all closed by even 10 o'clock is late. However, I do appreciate, as a mother of young children, it's like the only time I can go out without them. But that idea that we're leaving, you know, we do need light at night, but the length of time, the duration of time, is that really necessary? As well as, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of discussions of, is for our security, are we more secure when we're leaving all of these lights on all the way into morning time? Because essentially, if somebody were to come and do harm, how would they see if it's completely dark? They would have either have to already like have acclimated to being and living in darkness, which is very unlikely in our urban settings. So like the idea of like, then they would need to have light, so you'd be able to see them if somebody was up to mischief, because they would need some light to do whatever it is they're going to do.
And they said that there was a sociologist who interviewed a lot of convicted criminals of misdemeanors. And she's the basic, she asked, I think, a very basic question, like, so how did you pull it off? Well, it was lit up like at Christmas. It was easy. Everything was lit. I knew if it wasn't for the artificial light. So you're you're right.
I mean, I just feel like, there's that, we as a society, like on the bigger picture, we do, I think, individually have to start making some conscious choices of how we live in our environments. But I do think it is also bringing it up to on a local, regional, state, national, and international level, and awareness of how these rhythms and cycles are. It's not just solely impacting the insects and the birds. And I guess that's what I found so fascinating with this article in the Atlantic, or this interview with the Atlantic writer on noise pollution, because it was like certain species weren't being active and repollinating plant species or tree species because they were becoming so disoriented and couldn't function to do their biological function because they were so disoriented by the noise. And I feel like there's so much of that that's also with light and the impacts of light.
I do think that humans are disoriented. I think in one of the Nordic countries, there were many phone calls in the context of what you just said a couple of years ago to an emergency line, maybe like their version of our 911, about maybe some kind of explosion, which is good reason for a call. But then the explosion blacked out the electricity in this huge region. And people said there is this residual streak of like whiteness, light streak in the sky, and it's like what's hanging over our heads. And the emergency operators were instructed or told to say that's the Milky Way. Right? So if we're confusing insects about their biological space, then we're also so greatly confused at this point that we don't even recognize nature when we see it.
Well, that's actually really like, so we do a lot of backpacking. It's usually the first 2 nights of being out where you're in like the depths of the backcountry, you're above tree line. The stars are so like, I think I had shared with you an email, like I've like experienced vertigo because I felt like I was literally getting sucked up into the sky. But one of the hardest parts about sleeping in the backcountry the first couple nights is that it's so quiet, because you don't have all this residual white noise, to almost where, our bodies are sort of switching to where we are relying on this ambient lull or noise or roughness that's happening in our urban environments. And I think it's, same true to, as a mother with young kids, it's like having the nightlight on. But if it's too bright, it's like finding just that right, the right amount of light, that if you have to come in there in the middle of the night to help them, that you're not going to like tumble all over whatever is in the room. But that to where they naturally want to fall asleep when it's dark or almost completely dark. So it's interesting, like feeling of light and security, and how light brings us safety, when in reality it kind of, are we screwing ourselves up and our younger selves, and relying on, and as society, you mentioned that too, that as a younger person, it was sort of like light was shown as safety and as safe and as
Absolutely.
good, and night was seen as mischievous, dark, and and it's being a bad thing. So it's almost where our perception of what is bad and what is good the impacts of that, and not really, and it's because we haven't learned enough. We haven't fully understood as a society what it needs to be, and how we can find the right balance.
Yeah, in some ways we've unlearned it. I think before the artificial light was invented, we had figured that part of life out, and then we interrupted that, and it shouldn't be put away. It shouldn't go in reverse, but it should be modulated, because going into a bedroom to care for anyone, you're going to need a little bit of light. It's going to be incredibly helpful, and there's no problem with that. But
Right.
finding that spot where it's just enough and not too much, we turn the room lights off. But look, if there's any more proof of why we have eyelids, I don't know what it is.
Right.
Then who needs eyelids? Well, let's just get rid of those too.
Don't give anybody any ideas.
I know.
We don't need any modifications on that.
I'd like to think that imagination is such a trivial, funny, whimsical thing, but I am starting to feel like it's less so. But yeah, I think look, it's necessary. Surgeons depend on it. Air traffic controllers depend on it. There's a lot of benefit to the proper use of it, but there's also a great consequence to the improper use, and it's kind of like, anything else. If it can be a benefit, but it's not a net benefit, and we just seem to be interested in embracing the full effect of an invention before we've had time to see the negative impacts of the full effect of an invention.
Right.
Maybe that's human nature too. But it's like fire. I mean, the full effect of fire. I don't live in California, but the full effect of fire seems to me to be kind of scary. It's not a net benefit, but without it, where would we be?
Right.
So.
Well, and then, I think for, at least in California, which another artist that was actually featured in the exhibition with your work was sort of highlighting the California fires. So Christine Carr's work addressed that, and it's interesting because the giant sequoia trees rely on fire in order to repopulate, and there used to be natural fires that occurred that sort of would mitigate all of the underbrush in its own cycle, but because of the impacts of our choices and not fully understanding that some burning is required in order to manage and maintain and with all that suppression for so many years, just the impact that has caused. And thankfully this year, I mean, I know there's currently a wildfire that's at least 60% contained, but this year, thankfully, there has been far less than there were a few years ago. It was just a constant impact. And so it's I think with so many things, it's multi-layered. Things are all connected together. And but I think the fascinating thing about seeing your work in our space is that it sort of, I think, gave an opportunity to see what can be captured at night by our choice of illuminating what's being lit at night, and having that balance between, I know you use the word grotesque, but that that there's so much beauty in the light, but we're the moth to the flame, I guess is where I'm going with that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
That we are so captivated by the light that we want more of it, but we're not fully recognizing as a society that it can be our detriment.
And that's why I call it a pretty poison.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing your work with us and really providing an opportunity to really demonstrate to not just our campus through the work that was shown, but also for our students to be able to hear more about how the work is multi-layered and the dedication
Yeah,
that's that and sort of that devotion to practice what it is you're exploring and trying to seek out opportunities to really explore how to make a body of work, how to, that sometimes things don't happen in like a short time frame, that it may take many years.
yeah.
So thank you so much.
Very glad to be part of it, and I hope it's good for the students and that it has a present and future impacts, because there are a lot of great researchers who are um, drawing a lot of awareness to it as well. So I just want to drop in a huge bucket of concerned citizens for sure. So thank you.
All right. Well, I think that'll conclude our talk. And so Bill Davis photos.com will include his website and the captions when it is posted on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Bill.
Gladly. Appreciate it, Amy.